Everything you know about your history is a lie. That is what you discover when you read the ancient texts of Sumeria, the first ever documents created by humans. What if everything we know about our creation is a lie? Then what's the truth? Where do we come from? Who created us? And where are they now? These documents tell a story of our creation that is totally different from what we've been taught in school, and it's one that has terrifying implications for our future. In today's video, you will learn about the Anunnaki conspiracy and why scientists refuse to acknowledge it despite all the evidence we have uncovered. This is finally the truth about our alien creators. Everyone had a serious expression in the meeting chamber that day. This was a matter of life and death. Perhaps the most serious expression was on the face of Old Man Anu, the king. With all the power he wielded, he could do nothing to save his people from the upcoming cataclysm. Solar radiation was getting worse with every passing day, and it was clear that they were in the middle of a natural disaster they could do nothing about. But all of this was about to change. In a Hail Mary attempt at securing his people's future, Anu had sent out ships to seek solutions, and one of them had returned with good news. "We have found a place that has enough gold to power our climate purifiers," said the captain of the spaceship. The place he was talking about was Earth. Anu's home planet of Nibiru was heavily industrialized, and its atmosphere had started to break down. Fumes from its factories had formed a haze that was blocking beneficial sunlight. At the same time, the planet's ozone layer had become non-existent, leaving it vulnerable to a constant barrage of radiation. Anu's people took refuge underground and were living out their last days when they got word that a planet abundant in gold was within their reach, and they leaped for joy. You see, aside from it being attractive, gold has many functions. From its healing properties to its ability to conduct electricity, its benefits are numerous. But one that we rarely talk about is its ability to remove toxins from the atmosphere. Particles of gold can act as catalysts that remove carbon monoxide and other pollutants from the atmosphere. Who knows, maybe this is why the street of heaven is said to be made of gold. Anu's people knew about this, which is why they erected massive towers that used gold to purify their atmosphere at scale. But then, they ran out of gold and were awaiting their extinction until they learned about Earth. Anu was delighted to learn about this gold-rich planet, so he ordered people and his own son, Enki, to spearhead a mining mission powered by an army of slaves known as the Ajiji. The Ajiji did most of the grunt and slave work for Anu's people on the planet Nibiru, and things weren't going to be too different on Earth, so Anu's sons led the expedition with a massive army of the Ajiji on the lower decks. Soon, their aircraft would land on Earth, or as they used to call it, Kai. Anu's children were stunned by the Earth's beauty. It reminded them of what their planet used to be like thousands of years ago. Their incredibly long lifespans meant that they remembered the time when Nibiru also had similar greenery and unpolluted rivers. Their aircraft had landed between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, aka Mesopotamia, the cradle of human civilization. It's where humans organized into city-states for the first time. It's where literature, politics, and codes of ethics were born. But Anu's children didn't see any of this, because they had arrived more than 150,000 years before the first humans. The closest thing to modern humans at that time were Anu's children and their slaves. They had the capacity to reason and had a language. Meanwhile, our earthly ancestors were apes fighting off predators with sticks. Anu's children paid no mind to the apes and started to work their slaves in extracting tons of gold. These 15-foot giants would haul a heavy load into the ships, and when full, these ships upon ships full of gold were sent to Nibiru. Anu was pleased with the progress and appreciated his son Enki for doing a great job. But what Anu didn't know was that Enki was getting drunk on his power. He mistreated the slaves and even forced them to build a great city in just 7 days. Why did they need a city? To store gold that will last 3,600 years at a time. This is a very specific and important time for the Anunnakis. See, Nibiru didn't have an orbit like the rest of the planets in our solar system. Its orbit was elongated, and it would take 3,600 years to complete one revolution. That meant that every 3,600 years, Nibiru would get as close to the Earth as its path would allow. And that was the best time for Anu's children to send their ships full of gold from Earth. So that's how the system worked. Anu's son Enki oversaw a mining operation where the Ajiji did most of the grunt work. They extracted and stored gold for 3,600 years, and then sent it all back to Nibiru. Then the cycle would start over. This happened 42 times, spanning over 150,000 years, during which the Ajiji obediently put up with the increasing demands of their ruler Enki. But then, Mesopotamia started running out of gold. Enki allowed the operation to be expanded to neighboring regions, and this is where things got complicated. The Ajiji, who were stationed far away from the center of Enki's power, started to plan a rebellion. Murmurs of this spread throughout Enki's empire, and soon enough, the Ajiji enacted their plan and fought back. These were 15-foot giants, who looked a lot like Anu's children. But Anu's children were a unique breed born from the union of Anu and Ki, and were therefore called the Annunaki. Atrasis emerged as the leader of the Ajiji in this rebellion, which started in the mines. Initially, the Ajiji stopped working, so the Annunaki tried everything from torture to coercion, but the Ajiji wouldn't budge. Then came the next stage. The slaves had turned their mining tools into weapons, which they used to attack the Annunaki. Almost instantly, the city of Eridu became a battlefield. While the slave masters were trying to fight off the miners in Eridu, those who were stationed outside arrived as cavalry that the Anunnaki hadn't planned for. Soon, Enki's forces were overwhelmed. The slaves had taken over the mines and started killing off the Anunnaki captains. Soon, every Anunnaki stationed in the mines was either killed or thrown out. The Ajiji thought that they had won, but in reality, they had just put the final nail in their own coffin. They thought they were safe because they were holding all that gold hostage, but they would soon realize how wrong they were. A sudden rumble out of nowhere shook the mines. Seconds later, the mouth of every mine collapsed simultaneously. A feeling of dread washed over the Ajiji. Atrasis realized what had happened. The Anunnaki had trapped them in the mines. Only one opening was left, and the Anunnaki had their weapons trained on it. Any Ajiji that would come out would be killed. They were free to starve to death in those mines. Or maybe they could try eating all that gold they had taken hostage. Either way, they were going to die. That was the will of Enlil, the son of Enki. In some accounts, he's called Enki's brother. Either way, he was an Anunnaki who was in charge of the mines, and now he was ready to wipe out the Ajiji. Enki disagreed. The Ajiji had served his father for thousands of years, and for the sake of their shared history, he would give them one last chance to survive. And so it was decided. Any Ajiji to come out with chains would be spared, but anyone who continued to rebel would die. That's how the Ajiji were put back in chains, and the Anunnaki got back their gold. But Enki realized that he could never trust the Ajiji to work the mines again. The only reason they were defeated was that they had trapped themselves in the mines, and if another rebellion broke out, they could avoid that mistake and overpower the Anunnaki. So, Enki decided that he wouldn't send the Ajiji back into the mines. They would be given other tasks and kept away from each other. But someone would still need to do the group tasks, chief among which was mining gold. That's when Enki had an idea. What if he could create new slaves out of the existing inhabitants of the earth? The best candidate was an ape-like hominid that roamed the forests near the Euphrates. These creatures had opposable thumbs and could therefore use their hands to operate tools. Up to that point, the creatures had used rocks and sticks, but with a little genetic engineering, they could be made smarter. So, the Anunnaki got to work, capturing dozens of hominids. These were either Homo habilis or Homo erectus. Either way, they were about to turn into something else, something that the Anunnaki wanted. An ape that was intelligent, but not too intelligent, strong, but not too strong, and above all, small and submissive. The first couple of experiments didn't go as planned. The resulting creatures were monstrous and far from uniform. From two-headed giants to cyclops and banshees, each attempt resulted in a creature that could work in a haunted house, but not in the mines. These beasts were released into the wild and became a part of many early human legends. The Anunnaki realized that they would need to change their approach. Their next attempt was radically different. Instead of editing the genes of the ape, they spliced their own DNA with that of the ape's embryo. Then, they planted the embryo into a female ape of the same species. Previously, they had been growing their experiments in a lab, where they would grow to a gigantic size. But inside the female ape, the embryo grew to a natural size at a natural pace. Almost a year later, a child was born. The Anunnaki named him Adamu, or as the later generations would call him, Adam. This is how the creation of Adam was described in the earliest religious texts of Mesopotamia, and multiple creation myths follow the same trajectory. For instance, in Genesis, God creates Adam in his own image from the dust on the ground. In fact, in Hebrew, the word Adam means from the ground. In Sumerian and Babylonian texts, man was created by mixing the blood of a god with clay. Ancient Egyptians had a story about a god's tear being mixed with the clay of the earth to create a man. So almost every culture and religion has some version of the same story, that God made man to look like him and used some of his own genetic material for it. Even science talks about us evolving from apes to humans. But what if our evolution isn't technically correct as science puts it? Because monkeys, gorillas, and basically every other living thing on Earth have been living for a long time, and no other animal per se has drastically evolved into something else. The only thing we came close to evolving is hybridization, where the offspring is a result of combining or crossing the qualities of two organisms of different varieties, subspecies, or species. And maybe why no animal has evolved is because the Krabby Patty's secret ingredient for that is missing. But the truth, according to the story of the Anunnaki, is that man was an experiment, and a successful one at that. Adamu and his children went from a few dozen to a few thousand within a few centuries. The Anunnaki held their hands through the first 100 years, teaching them all the skills they would need. They were taught how to build homes, plant and harvest crops, and above all, mine gold. Initially, the Anunnaki were so happy with humans that they let them roam the same places as them. This privilege was never extended to the Ajiji. The first generations of humans, mainly Adamu and his partner, were allowed to visit their sacred Garden of Eden. And that's where the downfall happened. Humans didn't rebel like the Ajiji, they just wanted to chill. But because they looked like the Anunnaki, some Anunnaki started getting attracted to them. However, relationships between the Anunnaki, the Ajiji, and the humans were strictly forbidden. Genetic material was the strongest weapon that could not be traded willy-nilly. But who would stop Enki, the ruler of the Anunnaki on Earth, from sleeping with a human? Anu was thousands of years away on Nibiru. Enki had all the power on Earth, and he used it to sleep with a woman. Anyway, he impregnated a human woman, and from her was born Adapa. Now, think of him as Adam, but with the IQ of Einstein. All that careful genetic engineering of the Anunnaki went out the window when Adapa was born bearing superintelligence and unmatched physical strength. He was part human, part Anunnaki. Then, he married a woman named Atiti and had children who inherited his intelligence and bravery. They also inherited the Anunnaki desire for gold and power, which led to corrupt practices. The Anunnaki could see how their creation was spinning out of control, but they tried to keep interference to a minimum, even when they noticed another disturbing trait emerge in the children of Adapa. They were incredibly violent. The docile humans that had been carefully engineered to work the mines went extinct within a century. Many were murdered, while others simply fizzled out of existence because of a lack of mating opportunities. After a while, the only humans that were left on Earth were the children of Adapa, and they were wreaking havoc in the city of Eridu. Many of them were mating with the Ajiji, some were mating with the Anunnaki, and the children of these relationships were demigods and giants. It was at this moment that I had a flashback to the pantheon in Greek mythology, and I asked the crazy question with my tinfoil hat on. What if? The Anunnaki decided to retreat from Eridu and leave it to humans. Like anything left to humans, Eridu started failing. Adapa's children were too short-sighted to store their harvest. Human-on-human violence erupted everywhere. People were killing each other for food. This enraged Enlil, who had kept the city running and was also the Anunnaki who basically squashed the Ajiji rebellion earlier. He wanted to teach the new humans a lesson, so he sent a series of plagues, starting with a drought, then pestilence, and then famine. With each new plague, humans prayed to Enki, the Anunnaki responsible for their creation, and he helped ease their suffering. The way humans saw it, they had angered the gods, and the gods were getting their revenge, so they prayed for forgiveness. But in reality, Enlil was a very practical being who had run Eridu for almost 200,000 years. He had been sending the plagues to reduce the human population for practical reasons. Too many humans would be the end of all humans. And the Anunnaki didn't want that until their purpose was served. But because Enki kept saving humans from every plague, Enlil never managed to return order to the city of Eridu. Humans spilled out and built settlements in other areas, including Egypt. Wars kept breaking out for resources, and humans had to deal with everything from sickness to scarcity. And whenever they felt powerless, they turned towards their gods, the Anunnaki. They prayed to Enki, Enlil, and the rest of the pantheon, but were met with eerie silence. The Anunnaki had stopped responding. Humans went to look for them and realized that their gods had left them alone. Almost overnight, the Anunnaki had vanished. All their spaces were empty, with not even a sign that any of them had ever walked the earth. The vanishing of the Anunnaki happened around the same time as the Great Flood that is cited in many cultures across many countries. These people never came into contact with each other, yet built similar flood myths, often citing 8 survivors. They also allude to a supportive figure who helped the survivors rebuild civilization. And that's what the first theory is built around, that the Anunnaki went into hiding and occasionally popped out to help us survive. The cataclysm that wiped out most of the life on Earth did not drive us to extinction. Why? We didn't have advanced technology to predict or prepare for such an event, and we didn't have elaborate shelter systems and bunkers like we do now. Yet, against all odds, our furless ancestors managed to survive the equivalent of a 1,300-year ice age. Believers of the first theory argue that the Anunnaki helped humans survive. This theory takes on the view that humans had become more than what the Anunnaki initially intended them to be. They were more than monkeys meant to mine gold, and the creators of man took a more personal interest in them. The second theory takes the opposite view. According to this theory, the Anunnaki got enough gold to repair their climate and left. They knew that a cataclysmic event was about to occur and decided to save themselves, taking no humans with them. The escaping Anunnaki theory is contingent on the fact that this alien race was already fighting climate change on Nibiru and that they didn't have any resources to spare for a second cataclysm. Moreover, the Anunnaki seemed to be disappointed in humans, who were violent, greedy, and hard to control. For at least 1,000 years before their departure, the Anunnaki had stopped using humans for their labor and minimized contact with them. It seems like they wanted to wipe us out, but their morality wouldn't allow it. If we look back at how the Anunnaki rulers acted at the end of the Ajiji rebellion, we can see why they would spare humans. The Ajiji had been the Anunnaki's slaves for far longer than humans, so when the Ajiji rose up, it was a more serious betrayal of the Anunnaki's trust. Yet, Enki spared them. Enlil wanted to put them to death, but eventually, he too agreed with Enki. Some have speculated that the flood was one of Enlil's doings, and that Enki stepped in to help some humans survive. Whether the Anunnaki orchestrated the cataclysm or simply dodged it, the believers of the second theory agree on what happened to them. They went back to Nibiru. But there is one more theory left to explore. The third theory is far darker, at least for the Anunnaki. According to this theory, our creators could not survive the cataclysm. Ironically, they had come to our planet to extract resources for their own climate-affected planet, but a cataclysmic event followed them and eventually wiped them out. This theory hinges on the fact that we do not have an elaborate departure story in Sumerian mythology. There is a very strong and well-shaped narrative around the Anunnaki's arrival on Earth and their initial years before the creation of man. Even the creation of Adamu is captured in ancient myths. But the vanishing of the Anunnaki is sudden and without an elaborate farewell, and this leads many to believe that whatever happened to the Anunnaki was abrupt. Where the escape theory suggests that they left without saying goodbye, the extinction theory posits that they simply died. But there's a lot about these theories that don't make sense, opening doors for critics to ask pointed questions, like, where is the evidence of the Anunnaki even existing? This question applied to every theory regarding the Anunnaki. Whether they went into hiding and are remotely puppeteering our evolution, or they went extinct here on Earth, we need some kind of proof. We have yet to find an Anunnaki fossil that could prove the Sumerian creation myth was anything other than a myth. But if you believe that the Anunnaki are smart enough to create entire species and travel between planets, you can say that they are smart enough to hide their existence. Speaking of the hiding Anunnaki theory, critics wonder where such a species might be hiding. The ocean seems to be the only place we haven't really explored. but no myth or legend paints the Anunnaki as a water-dwelling species. And if we believe that the Anunnaki went into hiding on their planet, then again, we don't have any signals or signs of interference from such a planet. The major problem with this story is that it all came from one person, without any sort of collaboration. I mean, even the Bible has multiple collaborations from multiple sources, including the weird and bizarre ones. But this theory, especially the one with their planet, is all from one source. A major part of this narrative is based on one man's translation of the Sumerian texts, and that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. Zechariah Sitchin wrote The 12th Planet, in which he translated the Sumerian epic of creation into modern terms, replacing gods with aliens. And even though he honestly believed they were aliens, I have to say that replacing gods with aliens for the narrative was a very good move, because we've seen humans turn real events into religious mythology. You might have heard of cargo cults. Back in the late 19th century, remote tribes that were disconnected from the rest of the world were aided by Western planes that dropped food and other supplies. This led to the creation of new religions on different islands. Religions where the humans dropping the supplies were seen as a god. There are many cargo cults that are still active, and they continue to build models of planes out of straw and wood to worship them. If their myths are based on what they actually saw, but mistakenly attributed to God, maybe our myths are too, and that could mean that these gods were actually just advanced aliens from another world or dimension. Just look at that thing on top of the crescent in this Sumerian artwork. It looks like an aircraft. That being said, we must also keep in mind that Zechariah Sitchin's translation was more interpretation than translation. Back when he published The 12th Planet, the internet wasn't a thing, and people couldn't see Sumerian texts for themselves. Not only is the whole story from him, but it is a translation of the original text, and not only that, but it is also an interpretation of the translation, so the basis for error is really wide. Since then, we've made leaps in documenting and decoding these texts. Translations are freely available, and we can see where Sitchin took liberties in his work. For example, he translated the Anunnaki to mean those who from heaven came. But the academic consensus is that the term means princely seed or princely royal blood. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki came from outer space based on the following words. The Annuna, the gods, deities, whom An or Anu conceived in the sky. To take that line and translate it to a race of alien beings that resides in space is a bit of a reach. In such, that was why the Dead Sea Scrolls were important to the Christian faith, because with that, we could see if it was just the author's interpretation of the event, or if it was actually what happened. But alien or not, we might soon find out the truth about where things stand. The Sumerian myths were conceived nearly 4,000 years ago, which has more than exceeded the 3,600-year cycle that brings their planet close to Earth, which means it is possible that Nibiru might come around within our lifetimes. And given how the government has been slowly releasing information about UFOs, and how Hollywood has been making movies about benevolent aliens, it is possible that our higher-ups are mentally preparing us for when we make contact with the Anunnaki. Even before that, we might have found evidence here on Earth. In the early 1900s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley discovered the tomb of Paubai, a Sumerian queen. If we go by the Sumerian story, she's one of the earliest offspring of Adapa, who was the son of Enki. DNA testing could prove this, as her DNA might be different from some humans. It might have some genetic code that's clearly foreign to our species. The problem is that Pao Bai's remains were never tested. Instead, they were placed in the Natural History Museum in London. Her skull was elongated and didn't resemble the average human skull. But artificially deformed skulls have been a part of many cultures and do not prove non-human DNA. There's only one way to prove it, and it is to test Queen Pao Bai's DNA, which the Natural History Museum is open to, but only if a researcher with the right experience steps up to the task. And while you're waiting for that to happen, check out this video on the Nephilim giants from the Bible, who also seem to be real. I personally believe that when multiple cultures, including the Anunnaki video you just watched, come together to talk about a huge tall creature that walked on the earth at one time in human history, you pay attention to the story, especially when it comes with proof of giant skeletons that can't be explained. You should certainly click the link and watch the video.